and go.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sixth event in the fall 2021, winter 2022 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbart and Carl Wilson. Next week, on November 1st, Jake Johnson and Dean Hubbs will be here to talk about their respective books, Lying in the Middle, Musical Theater and Belief at the Heart of America, and Country Mexicans, Sounding Mexican-American Life, Love, and Belonging in Country Music. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021-2022 schedule for Popular Music Books and Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Siv B and Celeste Day Moore here to talk about their respective books, Django Generations, Hearing Ethnorace, Citizenship, and Jazz Manouche, just published by University of Chicago Press, and Soundscapes of Liberation, African American Music in Postwar France, recently published by Duke University Press. Siv B is Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Maryland. Her book, Django Generations, Hearing Ethnorace, Citizenship, and Jazz Manouche in France, shows how music and language shape ethno-racial and national belonging among French Manouche populations. She is co-founder and principal coordinator of the Initiative for Romani Music at New York University and a curator of the music section of Rome Archive. She's also a violinist, violist, and vocalist. Learn more about her work at www.sivblee.com. Celeste Day Moore is a historian of African American culture, media, and Black internationalism, and the author of Soundscapes of Liberation, African American Music in Postwar France, as well as essays in American Quarterly and the Journal of African American History. She's assistant professor of history at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. Follow her on Twitter at Celeste Day Moore. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Eric will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you. Eric will find them there at the end of the presentations. And also feel free to post comments throughout the conversation. So I'll now turn things over to Siv and Celeste.
All right, well, thank you so much, Kim and Eric and Carl. We are so excited to be here, and we're just so glad when we got the acceptance that our proposed panel had been included in the series. We've been following it for a while since it came out last year, and we're just so excited about it. So thank you. And we also wanted to give a little shout out to Ben Given, who's here today. He is actually responsible for Celeste and I even knowing each other in the first place, because he helped us co-organize a panel at SEM 7 years ago. So Ben is responsible for so much and has been so supportive of us this whole way through. And even when Celeste and I actually didn't know that each of us had submitted to this series, and Ben said, hey, maybe you should know about each other's books, and et cetera. And we thought, oh, why don't we just do the series together? So, so thanks again, Ben, for that. Yeah, we decided that the way we're going to do this is just to have me speak first for about 10 minutes or so, and then Celeste just introducing our books and talking a little bit about our process. And then we're just going to have a dialogue between each other after that. And I would also be mistaken if I didn't also give a shout out to the staff at the University of Chicago Press, who did just such an amazing job getting this book out even earlier than I anticipated. So there's a lot of excitement before I even was ready for it. So that was great. One other thing I want to say too is that Celeste and I spoke the other day, and we, in talking and also reading each other's work, realized that our panel isn't really about French jazz so much as it is about France and race, because both of us we work on jazz to some extent, although Celeste does more than just that. But we were finding a lot of commonalities between our books, in ways that they speak to each other, and yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here, of course.
We decided to keep it as a good straw man, though. So yeah, welcome to the French jazz panel, in which we will not talk. Oh, we will engage that and not engage it.
Great. So I guess I'll just get started with my PowerPoint. So let me just share my screen. While I'm doing that, I also want to say hello to everyone that I know who is here, especially my mom. Hi, Mom. So here we go. Is that visible enough for everyone? Great. Okay, so here we have this lovely book cover. In my book, Django Generations, Hearing Ethnorace, Citizenship, and Jazz Manouche in France. So this book is about the entanglement of racial ideologies and citizenship with musical communication in France. I focus on a genre that's called Jazz Manouche, which is also known in English as Gypsy Jazz. And this genre is based primarily on the recorded work of the famed guitarist Django Reinhardt, who is known as one of, if not Europe's most celebrated jazz musician. And Django also happened to belong to the Romani group of Manouche, for which the genre is named. So to give you a sense of what this music sounds like, I want to first play an example of some of the source material from Django Reinhardt, and then I'll play you an example of contemporary Jazz Manouche performance. So this sample is a tune called Django's Tiger, which is based on the chord changes to Tiger Rag, which in turn was originally recorded by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And I have a reference down here to Ben's fabulous article that traces the adoption of this tune into the Jazz Manouche repertoire. Pause it there. You just heard a tiny little sample of Stefan Grappelli's violin solo, but what Django just played was more or less an improvisation. And so this next clip I want to play is from my own fieldwork videos, and it features Jorgi Leffler, who's in the middle, soloing with his brother, Gigi Leffler, on rhythm guitar to our right. And to our left is his cousin, Billy Weiss. And so he's performing Swing 48, which is originally a Django composition. And this video was taken in 2014. So as you can tell from these clips, this genre is very string-centric and especially guitar-centric, given especially its roots in Django's music and how he really pioneered the use of the guitar as a solo instrument in jazz. But it's not just about the soloing. Jazz Manouche also involves a rhythm guitar technique known as la pompe, literally the pump, which you heard in this last clip especially. It's a very kind of driving, very regular, almost percussive right hand technique that is really a hallmark of the genre. So this instrumentation explains in part my own beginnings with the genre, because I've played violin and viola ever since I was a kid. And although I was classically trained as a teenager, I started wanting to learn how to play jazz. And if any of you are violinists or violists and you've tried to make this transition from classical music to jazz, you know that one of the first examples that you are typically given is Stefan Grappelli, who is Django's most well-known collaborator. So I got into Jazz Manouche as a performer in a very amateur way, but I also learned more about the cultural context in which this music was made. And as I did that, I also got very interested in the larger political questions about Romani identity more broadly. And so that, along with a very supportive and research-oriented undergrad foundation in anthropology, led me to go to grad school for ethnomusicology to study how this genre was being used in Romani political contexts. And I should also add that throughout my life, I've had a lot of connections to France through family and friends, and I began speaking French in my early teens. So it just kind of made sense for me to do a project like this in France. So speaking of France, as I'm sure many of you in this audience are aware, Romanis, who are otherwise known often pejoratively as gypsies, have long been subjects of persecution and discrimination in Europe and beyond. But also, as many scholars have pointed out, they are also celebrated for their music and other performance art forms. And Jazz Manouche is no exception to this process. It was pioneered largely, though not exclusively, by Manouche musicians, and it's probably the most widely and positively recognized Manouche cultural practice that there is in existence. At the same time, Jazz Manouche is considered to be a musical emblem of French national identity, despite the fact that Manouches face quite a bit of discrimination in France and are not considered part of its national cultural fabric. Now, this situation is exacerbated by the fact that France likes to see itself as a colorblind nation, and I know Celeste is going to talk quite a bit about that too. So in the eyes of the law, ethno-racial and religious differences aren't really supposed to be recognized. So what this means is that candid talk about race is often censured, whereas racially minoritized groups live the effects of racialization all the time. So they're kind of caught in this paradox. So one of the arguments that I put forth in the book is that music and discourse about music provide avenues for people to deal with racialization when the more obvious avenues might not be available. And in some cases, and with varying degrees of success, they also seek to transform their positions as racialized subjects through these different semiotic means. As I argue in the book, music can be an important but also an insufficient tool in struggles for racial and economic justice. And Jazz Manouche provides a very potent opportunity for understanding how these struggles play out. One intervention I want to bring up here is a concept that I develop in the book that's called ambivalent essentialism. By ambivalent essentialism, I mean the process in which a minoritized person will self-essentialize to some end, be it social, political, and/or economic, and the attendant uncertainty and cognitive dissonance that comes along with that essentialization. So for Manouche musicians, this means playing up the so-called Manouche aspects of their identity when marketing themselves, but also having to grapple with the discomfort that doing so can arouse. And in some cases, that discomfort leads people to do a complete 180 and refuse to self-essentialize completely, or at least to refuse the label of Jazz Manouche in order to prove themselves as regular, unmarked artists and citizens. So to illustrate this, I'm just gonna read a brief passage from my book, just a little story about how ambivalent essentialism plays out. And this is on pages 18 to 19 of my book. It was nearing midnight at the brasserie where I had gone to hear a Jazz Manouche concert. For an hour or so after the final set, I drank beers with the Manouche musicians' entourage at the tables near the stage. Given the late hour, I decided to take my leave and approached one of the performers, Pascal, to say goodbye. I had gotten to know Pascal over the previous several months, and he knew that I was conducting research on the political implications of music making for Manouche. Upon noticing me, he took me aside from the throng of people. Locking eyes with me, he declared that he was not into politics and that he only wanted to do business. He pleaded with me to show the positive, not the negative, and not to get him, quote, involved with all this political stuff. Although I had long sensed some reluctance on his part to engage in the politically minded pro-Manouche musical activities for which others had solicited him, this was the first time he ever stated his position so bluntly to me. I told him I understood that he did not want to portray himself or his family publicly as victims of racism, to which he responded with relief, saying, "You know me." He then continued to the bar to order the round of drinks he owed his cousins and continue what would surely be a much longer evening than mine. A few weeks later, I recalled this encounter as I listened to Pascal perform with some local musicians at an exhibition of Romani arts in Strasbourg. The exhibition was sponsored by several prominent political and cultural institutions and featured works by Romani artists from all over Europe that addressed issues of Romani marginalization and inclusion. As part of its opening events, the exhibition's organizers, based at a foreign university, had decided to program a concert to represent their commitment to involving local artists within this context of pro-Romani activism. But having translated between the English-speaking organizers and the French-speaking musicians in their contract negotiations, I knew that Pascal understood his purpose there differently than the organizers did. While he told them that he was completely on board with their activist vision, he considered this to be merely one gig among others. It didn't matter so much that he was hired to represent Alsatian Manouche to an international audience. His main concerns were to earn a good salary and to gain some high-profile exposure. Each party's understandings of what music was supposed to do in this context diverged, though they did not appear that way to others. Pascal was acutely aware of and frustrated by the fact that his music was being politicized, even if that politicization helped him to reach his own goals of financial security and publicity. He was reluctantly willing to associate himself with this kind of event only to the extent that the payoff outweighed what he saw as a compromise to his artistic reputation. The organizers, on the other hand, had the impression that Pascal deliberately served as a representative of his Manouche community and was taking on this performance as an act of pan-Romani solidarity. They thought that paying him was a gesture of appreciation, and thus they too became frustrated when, during the contract negotiations, Pascal asked for a higher salary than they had offered. So that, I think, I'm just gonna stop there and cede the mic to Celeste, and we'll go from there. So here we go.
Thank you, Siv. And yeah, so much we have to talk about. We tried not to overly script our conversation so that we would just kind of continue from this. But yeah, as a kind of starting point, I just first of all so glad to be here and seeing faces and names I know and some I don't, and sort of like seeing some of your faces and names, I think about, you know, my own work, right? You're kind of, so many of you were a big part of that, and the space was too, listening to these conversations. So I'm just going to put a timer on, so I'm a little bit conscious of time. I really embraced the process part of the books in process sort of brief. So I wanted to talk about that. I haven't really had a chance to do that yet. So I hope you'll indulge me slightly. I'm going to show a few images in a moment, but I'm going to start with a bit of a narrative, which is how I got kind of into this project and how I began to conceive of it. And it really came into focus for me in 2010, which is my first major dissertation research trip. And I was going to the very small town of Souillac in the southwest of France, and they had a local library. And I had learned from another person that they had recently acquired the collection of the American radio host Sim Copans, who hosted for 30 years, I would discover later, radio programs about African-American music in France. And at this point, I had been working for several years, this archival project in Chicago run by Jacqueline Goldsby, which was kind of an amazing opportunity, with a lot of different graduate students working in the archives of African-American history and trying to process them. And so the politics of archival work, of preservation, I was really deep into those questions in terms of how their relevance to African-American history and cultural history. And so I found out, when I was supposed to go to France, I'd heard from the person managing the archive, and she sent me this long list of all the books they had in the collection. And I thought, I really hope I am not traveling to France to see someone's book collection, because I'm not sure how I write a dissertation based on that. So I, out of my meager research funds, I make it there to this small town. And thankfully, what I discovered was that what they had not thought it was as important were all of these boxes, dusty boxes, about 100 boxes in total, but many of them were the materials, the papers, the personal collection of this figure. And it was decades of correspondence, listener letters, studies, radio transcripts, State Department records, albums, pamphlets, lecture notes, this kind of ephemera and material remnant of music and music meaning making. And for me, that was when the project, I guess we all narrate ourselves and our own journeys in terms of our work in different ways. So perhaps this is all kind of me looking backward, but I think I remember the kind of first glimmers of understanding what I was going to be doing in my book, which took a while to come into completion, but is here, which is a focus on thinking about the history of music through its materiality, its mediation, and its intermediaries, and drawing attention primarily, though not entirely, and I'll come to this, to those who shaped its interpretation, facilitated its distribution, carefully managed and translated its meaning, but also thinking to Brent Hayes Edwards's work, also on France and race, also mistranslated its meaning frequently. This became the focus, and this dusty archive that I first spent 3 months in became the foundational space for the project, which, as I conceived it pretty early on, and I, in ways, kept with that structure, is organized around thinking about the different spaces of mediation of music, the project begins, the book begins by thinking about the military, the US military, and its role in shaping how jazz in particular sounded and in what way it was heard in the context of liberation. I look at the publishing industry and some well-known jazz memoirs, Mesro's memoir, for those of you familiar with that sort of bit of jazz history, how it was translated into French, and also a chapter on the record industry, the French record industry, and its specialization and categorization of African-American music, looking at jazz and blues and gospel and spirituals. I look at the circuits of Black internationalism, so building on the interwar negritude period, which and into the post-war period, where you see the African-American spiritual in particular take on really different kinds of political power for Black audiences and performers in the 50s, 40s and 50s. And then also looking at the US State Department, as well as French colonial political interests in a wide range of African-American musical forms. And this is where this Sim Copan's figure becomes another central one. People who are using radio and television networks to broadcast particular political interpretations of what African-American music is. Attention to these different networks and circuits, which is kind of how I conceived of the project, also I think helped the books not be just France. In fact, it never could be, but it really took me into archival spaces and collections, not just in small French towns, but in the US and other parts of France and Senegal. Kind of, I think, made me really alive to the kind of transnational dimensions of this history, which I can say more about, but that really comes together at the end of the book, which looks at Francophone Africa and how all of these kind of meaning-making systems and networks converged in ways that, in a way were structural, but then also were transformed, understandably, unsurprisingly, when you're moving into a different kind of post-colonial era and space. So there's two things I wanted to share with it. I have about, I have 3.5 minutes. I'll show these. As I was thinking about this project and these networks, these linkages, and I was, reading more deeply into sound studies. For many of you know this work. I became increasingly drawn to the idea of a soundscape. And it started to appear to me to be a really helpful way of conceiving of the project, which is, I think on one hand, speaking to the physical and acoustical environments in which music is made and performed and heard, whether that's in a performance space or across radio and television networks or in individual and collective record listening. But also, of course, how it then transformed the means and modes of perception. That is to say, soundscapes are a way of thinking about the physical materiality, but also how people's I think I'll say it like this, like brains are changed, right, in the ways they conceive of the world through music. And I think this is exciting for me to think about this. It was an important methodological term for me because I do think that through the material conditions that I'm tracking in the book, the encounter with African-American music was transformed, and it became, not simply, a sonic diversion or background music to the post-war period, but something that demanded new modes of discernment and perception, and linked people in ways that sometimes were forthright and sometimes obscure, which Steve and I can talk about, to broader transformations in France, like decolonization. So let me just show an image a second. Let's see if I can still talk while you look. So you can see this picture right here. This is the kind of, I think, illustrates some of that soundscape, at least as I read this image, right? That this is an image from the 1951 Salon du Jazz, which was this kind of commercial display of jazz. It was kind of all these different record labels coming together to celebrate their commodification of African-American music, to be quite forthright. And so in this space, you had a lot of African-American musicians, but representations of African-American musicians like Armstrong here, right? So this to me is an interesting soundscape in a sense. You have two French listeners, right, gathered around a record player. You can see the advertisement for this long playing record in France. And I think about this, right, as a moment, we can think about it as a listening moment. You can think about it as those who are engaged in listening, but also imagining, right? You have Armstrong kind of hovering over them in a sense, but I also, and that picture of him, that sense of him and the ways in which he was defined in critical writing and liner notes and all these ways, right, was absolutely transforming the encounter with this music, right? That's one of the things I find really interesting, at least in this particular soundscape. So, this image, I think, in a way does capture a lot about what the book is about. But it also doesn't, and one of the things that I'll kind of end with, and this really does speak to some of the questions that Steve was bringing up, while the book is organized around networks of mediation, and also all of these intermediaries, many of whom were white, but not all. It's also focused on how they were experienced and contested by Black musicians and audiences, whose sharp observations, strategic essentialisms and ambivalent essentialisms, interpretations, interventions would further transform the political value and power of African-American music in France. And for Afro-European audiences and critics and musicians, adopting African-American musical traditions could be a way of claiming expertise or locating an authentic musical identity or initiating different debates about the nature of French colonialism and racism. And they did so, again, as Steve was talking about, right, in a language and nation that was resistant to conversations about race, which meant that a discourse around African-American music was a really key mode of dialogue and expression. The stakes for African-American musicians were different, and their experiences, and I talk a lot about the different ways in which they encountered these structures. But their experiences in France depended on a range of factors: when they arrived, how long they stayed, the presence of interpreters. But in most cases, they found themselves excluded from the mechanisms of mediation, even though their music and frequently their bodies were essential to its production. Just to succeed, they had to navigate the conditions of French musical production and distribution and actively reclaim their right to create, define, and control the musical creations of African Americans, which is why I was really drawn to this image that I have here outside of my cover, This is Armstrong and his All-Stars in 1955 at the Olympia in Paris. And I think this captures, right, I think obviously a soundscape. We can imagine this as a sound environment, but one that was shaped by French commercial interests, by critical voices, by political imperatives. And so I kind of see that, we're kind of foregrounding that, the ways in which Armstrong and his band were kind of surrounded by that. And yet I think, on one hand, I guess there's a political motive in sort of foregrounding an African-American performer in a book about African-American music, right, for me, but also I think the stage itself, right, was one of the many places where performers kind of critiqued, undermined, improvised upon the structures they found themselves in. So I don't know what, actually don't know what Armstrong said about, he was a lot more constrained than a lot of performers that I can talk about for a lot of reasons. But the stage was a place to begin to kind of trouble some of the ways in which they found themselves there. So yeah, that's me. So yeah, I think that's our 10 minutes or more than.
Yeah, so that was great, Celeste. Thank you also for showing, those images are super helpful for me to, get a closer understanding of all the issues that you're grappling with.
I'm looking at Carl's. Yes, I have the same feeling about those, looking as French as you possibly can. And that's like, that's why it's so perfect. I'm like, did you do your scarf just like that? But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, I want to get to some of these questions, I think maybe during the Q&A period, but I just wanted to maybe kind of now start talking about these questions that we had for each other that we didn't want to delve too much into when we were talking the other day, because we had so much to say. But one of the questions we wanted to both respond to is, how did we experience France as researchers? So I don't know, Celeste, if you want to say something first, I'll follow too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I was thinking as I was reading your introduction, right, your experience and your racial identity, your gender identity, right, is foregrounded as an ethnographer in a way in your work. And I don't talk about it as much in my book, but what I think this is where Siv and I stopped talking in advance because we realized we would be able to say so much. But I think both of us had that experience. In my case, like viscerally, when I would first introduce my project. And on one hand, right, as a white American woman, I feel like I was entering into spaces and allowed to ask questions and invited into spaces and homes in ways that, I was very kind of intrigued by, right, how I kind of fit into some of those relationships. Especially I was interviewing initially a lot of older white French men about their kind of role in this world. And but what I found, and I'm curious how you asked those questions, Siv, too, like when I would say, well, initially I would say, oh, I'm writing about music and race, and people would just like physically recoil from me, like as though I had done something like that I had said, and I really didn't get it at first. I spoke French, but I didn't really understand exactly how people perceived that question. And then I found myself kind of pulling back from that question for a while because I thought, well, okay, this is like, I can't do this. I'm not allowed to ask about that. And then the more and more I spent talking to people, I realized that, part of what I could do was I could ask that question and push back. And it was an interesting kind of journey for me. I don't know if, Steve, you found that you changed your style or like that your research experience like shifted over time, and especially when it comes to race.
Yeah, definitely. So, and it's kind of funny. Like, so I came into this project with, trained in the US with like a very kind of US based understanding of how race works. Wasn't like I knew something about the French context and I knew that it was different and I knew that there was this legacy of republicanism, but it took years for that to really sink in. And when I initially went into the field and asking these questions, I wasn't using the word race or even ethnicity for that matter very much. I was saying like Romani music, Jazz Manouche. I was using like the terms that they used. And at first, and I think this actually gets to a bit of Dan's question, I came into this very, very green, very kind of wearing these rose-colored glasses to mix color themed metaphors. But I was thinking I wanted to see how people were using music as a form of resistance. And, I had seen from what I had understood in my own experience in France, and then also just reading about it and listening to things that, there were some Manouche people who were using this music as a form of cultural activism. And that was true to a certain extent. But when I got there, as the passage that I described shows, like a lot of musicians were really not on board with that. And they didn't like that I was taking that angle. And so I kind of had to readjust. But even within that, the question of like race as a concept, still didn't really factor that much into what I was doing on the ground. It wasn't until later that I really started putting the pieces together, especially when I was in conversation with another French anthropologist who just kind of had to like very clearly point out to me, like, what you're talking about is something that we aren't talking about. And I was like, oh, really? Okay. Now everything is starting to make a lot more sense. Even when I showed some passages of this work to some of my interlocutors who were already themselves involved in anti-racist activism, had been for decades, specifically geared towards anti-Romani racism. At first, they were skeptical of my framing of race. And I was like, but isn't this what you've been struggling against all along? And so eventually, like, we talked and they kind of came around and understood better what I was doing. But when that happened, I was like, oh man, if these people are skeptical of my framing of it, I can only imagine what, other French people who are not involved in this kind of work are going to think. And I guess this might be a good, I don't know if you want to respond to some of that too.
Well, I was just going to say too, I think one of the like fascinating things was that, I did eventually kind of start talking to people who I think would perceive themselves or position themselves as being anti-racist in their own relationship to French politics. And it was fascinating. One of the most striking moments, again, this is also something I wasn't really able to write about, but for those of you who read part of the book or the intro, I talk about this concert by Ray Charles in the midst of the Algerian War. And I was interviewing a French academic, actually. Well, I wasn't even, we were having dinner, but I was talking about this concert. And I said, that he was only able to perform after they moved the North African people who had been detained to a different spot. And he said, no, that didn't happen. It didn't happen. I was there at the concert and it didn't happen. And he was just like, it was like the end of the conversation. They kind of left the dinner table. And then like his wife was there too. And then he came back and he had gotten a book that from his shelf about these events in 1961. And I think became aware that I was right. I mean, it was actually, for me at first, I was like, I think, I was really kind of questioning. I was pretty early in research. And it was just such an important moment of kind of silence. I mean, and for those of you who are French historians or French people knowledgeable about France manages this, silence is a critical part of this. This happened to me interviewing critics I was interviewing someone about his first encounter with a song or a radio program. And then all of a sudden he started to cry because he was remembering he was in Algeria when he first heard it. And it was like this thing that just kind of came to the surface, but so it's like, it's not even below, it's not even deep under the surface. It's just a part of this, this kind of memory or sort of shared narrative or shared kind of fiction that people participate in. So yeah, it's interesting to think about even people who are sympathetic don't always have the capacity to talk about it.
Yeah, and I'm just so curious too about how you deal with these questions of, or these moments of silence and how you make something of them, because there's a lot that can be read into what is not there and what people refuse, and all of that. So yeah, I think that was a really also the story that you opened up the introduction with, I just thought was kind of perfect and really got at so many of the issues that you're tackling really beautifully.
I don't know. Should we talk a little bit about like the kind of genre and jazz in France or French jazz before we turn to questions? Does that sound okay? I don't know. I'm aware of time. Yeah. So, I mean, how did you see like encounter, I guess you went in with a genre in a sense to your research. I mean, how do you, I mean, do you feel like that kind of French jazz in France? I was thinking about the times I've been in a sort of context in which like Jane Ho Reinhardt's music is like, it's like chosen as a particular kind of soundtrack to a kind of particular experience. I mean, I guess Woody Allen is a, you know, potent example, but I was curious how you kind of dealt with that genre.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was, you know, of course, given that the word manouche is in the name of the genre, it kind of fit perfectly for the kinds of like, you know, racial and political questions that I was asking. But what soon became very clear to me when I was talking to people is that a lot of them hate the name of the genre and they don't want to be associated with it, especially manouche performers, because they find it extremely limiting. And, you know, they don't want to be kind of pigeonholed as performing in one genre that also is pretty vulnerable to critique as a very kind of static genre, because it is really based on the reproduction of Django's music. There are certainly some creative avenues that performers take, but a lot of it really is about like recreating what he did. And some people go to great lengths to do that. So what I found was like Jazz Manouche was a great starting point, also to reflect on like the status of jazz writ large and how people thought of that in France, because it was always kind of like, you know, like a not quite a foil, but like Jazz Manouche was often measured by its distance from or similarity to jazz, you know, whatever that is. But then I also, you know, came across a lot of other kinds of questions about genre having to do with basically what other musicians were interested in doing and how they used other genres in tandem with or in combination with Jazz Manouche to prove a point in some ways. Of course, they had their own, you know, artistic goals as you know, purely for the art itself, but then, you know, they had a lot to say about their choices to incorporate different things. So a lot really centered on both kind of embracing Jazz Manouche and then also rejecting it both as a label and as a practice.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I know, and I definitely would love to hear you say more about how you got into what you did in terms of genre, because, you know, it's so much more than jazz, what you're looking at.
I definitely came in thinking it was jazz, and there were like a number of ways in which that got kind of exploded for me in terms of genre. I mean, one was that I just kept on finding material about particularly this kind of category of the Negro spiritual, which was a really popular genre in France in the post-war period. And so I think initially I was just kind of like pushing it aside, saying, that sounds really interesting, but that's not what I'm doing. And then finally realized, oh yeah, I could do that. And there were also conversations with musicians. There's a conversation with Archie Shepp really early on in my research, in which he just kind of, you know, in the way that he did, like kind of sort of, I mean, he rejected the genres, right, of the marketing. He rejected the genres of commercial industry, and, you know, spoke to, I think, a kind of, you know, especially in thinking about ownership and claims and African diasporic claims to a kind of, I mean, not just great Black music, which was something else kind of circulating in the period I'm writing about, but of creative music and a kind of a musical genius that he wanted to lay claim to. So it felt right for a number of reasons. But also, then the third reason was, or way I was thinking about it was, because I spent a lot of time on the record industry. I mean, it just became so clear how much they were creating their own genres and categories to market African-American music. And frequently, and sometimes in line with how those categories have been created in the United States, but with really different kinds of terms and with different resonances. And so I think kind of getting bigger than jazz, I think, you know, was a way of kind of getting outside of what felt kind of like a narrow discussion. I don't know. I mean, it's not narrow, but it felt like in France it was. And also, I think, a way of respecting how African-American musicians and performers and writers were thinking about their musical work, and both in and outside of these systems of kind of political, you know, maneuvering and commoditization. So yeah, it was, yeah, I'm glad to think about genre, yeah, with you.
Yeah. I also wanted to, I know this is something that we talked a little bit about, and again, kind of had to pull ourselves back from, but, you know, so your discipline is history, mine is ethnomusicology / I prefer to say music studies more generally, but, you know, it is what it is. So, you know, we necessarily came at it with similar but overlapping, overlapping but different methodologies. So I'm wondering if you could maybe say a bit about your own methodological concerns, you know, kind of.
I mean, it's very archivally driven, my project. And in that sense, I'm such a, kind of classic and I don't even know, historian who kind of tries not to romanticize the archive and yet still does. But also, looking at, material culture and sound recordings and kind of oral resonances. So I guess in that sense, my methodology is looking at, what is left of a kind of time period in a lot of ways. But I did a lot of interviews, and as I was reading your work, I was thinking about that, and they all were transformative for me. An interview with Steve Potts in which I said, like, why France? Thinking he had something kind of romantic to say. And he was like, 6 train stations, 2 airports. And that was it. Like, that's why, because it was central, so I think that's one. I'm sure there's others, but people who would kind of, so yeah, the methodology was really archivally driven, but really shaped by interviewing and conversations for me. Yeah, what about you?
It's interesting to although, as an ethnographer, in the kind of very general sense of ethnography, it's about being there and talking to people. But of course, there has to be some historical research. So I feel like we're kind of coming at the same things from opposite directions almost. In that, like, a lot of my work ended up being archival, and I got really lucky to stumble upon some great archives in Strasbourg and elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I had a lot of ethical concerns that I will take to the grave with me, because it's just, like no matter how well you address them, like there's still going to be some nagging things. And so, I was concerned about the ethics of interviewing for sure, and like reproducing the words of people that, spoke them in one moment years ago, and then, putting those back on the page, and just, trying to follow up with people and making sure that they are okay with what I'm saying. But a lot of it also had to do with the ethics of the archives as well, because there were some materials that I knew the people who put them there, or, were involved with them, would not want those reproduced or talked about. So it was a very kind of like delicate balance, especially with a lot of this book, or some key parts of it, chapter 2, parts of chapter 5, deal with a nonprofit organization whose acronym is APONA, and they were the leading anti-racist for Romani specifically organization in Alsace from the mid-1970s up to the early 2000s. And I had access to a lot of material. I spoke to a lot of the former members, and I had to grapple with the fact that I both really lauded and appreciated the work they did. They were doing amazing work, but I was also critical of some of it too. And so I had a lot of back and forth with myself, and then with the members that I had spoken with as well, just to make sure that, I could do my critique without it coming across as, something wholly negative. And I still struggle with that, because I feel like any critique I lodge at them might be misread as a total critique. So that's also been kind of an ethical question as well.
I'm looking at the time. I don't know if
oh geez. Sorry.
Should we come in with some questions now? I think you're right on time, not long or any. I mean, just incredibly well organized. Thank you for the great presentations and the dialogue, and have some questions to start out with from different people. If a couple more people want to throw things in the mix, I'll try to squeeze everyone in there. But Dan, fortunately, Siv resisted the impulse to answer your question too early. So come on in and start us off as you did, in fact, in the comments.
Sure, thank you. This was really great. Just to sort of restate what I was saying, I've found that story that you started with, Siv, and I apologize, I can't remember the name of the person you were talking about. Yes, thank you. I just feel as though, particularly for scholars who might be approaching their work, as you mentioned, hoping for or looking at music as a social experience that might offer models for different types of resistance. And I don't want to flatten all resistance into like one format, because I do believe that there are ways that music can work beyond the conscious mind, and that we, might not always be able to articulate what it is about that relationship that we find meaningful. But nevertheless, I was just wondering what that story and that anecdote might have to tell music scholars, at least in terms of how you're framing it in your book. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you for this question, and you've really got at one of the kinds of scholarly, I wouldn't say it's an intervention, but just kind of a commentary that I have, which is, I mean, it really comes down to being honest with with yourself and with what people are actually telling you and displaying. And I think part of our job is to see what's going on, sometimes in ways that the people who are in the thick of it may or may not see. But I also wanted to give a lot of credit to the people I was working with and be clear about how they were feeling. Now, that said, part of this whole, I would say part of the ambivalent essentialism thing is also has to do with like a diversity of perspectives. And I think in any community that you go into, nobody's going to agree on, what the right approach is and what their common goals should really be. So I saw a lot of that, a lot of differences in everything from our music should be 100% for pleasure, not political, like we just want to make money, versus or we just want to enjoy ourselves and make money, versus some people I talked to who were all in for the cultural activism part of it, and then some people who were kind of on the fence there. So I try to represent all of those different standpoints, while also showing that sometimes people's economic and personal and social concerns really do bleed into the political in ways they may intend or they may not intend. So there's no simple way of parsing it out. And I guess that's really the thing I wanted to make clear, is that, I didn't want to, put this under the umbrella of resistance, but really try to tease out, what that resistance can look like in so many different shapes. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's turn to Jonathan. Jonathan, you had questions for both of our presenters, which I think is totally fine, and there's room, but let me suggest that you start with Celeste and then back to Siv, just to kind of keep the order going back and forth. Is that all right?
That's perfectly fine, Eric. Thank you. But thank you, Siv, as well. Like, I'm excited to read both of these. Just excited that new work's coming out, using France as kind of a case study. As you know, somewhat near and dear to my own heart. So Celeste, reacting off of your photo, given the increased availability of turntables, transistor radios, other forms of kind of musical dissemination, I wonder if you might speak to the segregation of French audiences. Certainly we know that there was a large population of North Africans, of Caribbean French, and this minority population was very interested in African American music. It was a great influence on genres, if we can use that term, but genres such as zouk in France. So, but here we're seeing it marketed primarily to white audiences. So I wonder if you might be able to speak on that, like this, because I know you've looked at
Right.
record companies. So
yeah,
thank you both, by the way.
Oh, yeah. This is thank you so much. I feel like the one of the things I noticed when I was looking at the record company materials, so I was looking at Vogue and Barclay, which are the two big ones in terms of post-war French popular music, and they have this one catalog where they define as kind of a marketing category the songs that Black American people like to dance to. And so it's like kind of thinking about the sort of how their marketing is drawing on their sense of segregated audiences frequently, and the sense of segregation within the US market. In terms of how that plays out within France and the empire, I wish I had more information about the kind of ways in which they would have marketed differently within France. I don't know a lot of, I didn't see that exactly in terms of a different marketing strategy. But what I did see, starting in the 1960s, they're working really actively to find distribution channels in Francophone Africa and Senegal in particular. And there's a really different way in which records are distributed, at least in kind of the immediate post-colonial period. And when doing research there, I mean, one of the things that was really fascinating was airline stewards, and were one of the major conveyors of records to young listeners in the 60s, especially African-American music and soul. And I, one of the things that I talk about in the last chapter is some of James Brown's earliest trips to Senegal and how he and his band members experienced African audiences. And they talked a lot about, lots of people sharing one record player and having one record. And this comes up in other kind of cultural artifacts of this period. So I think there's a kind of a scarcity in a way when it comes to record players and records. Radio is less so because there were, I think the sort of post-colonial landscape, I don't want to say it was flooded, but there were a lot of transistor radios because everyone wanted to make sure that post-colonial people were listening to them, whether it was BBC or Voice of America, various kinds of networks. So radio had a kind of political importance, but records were a little different. So yeah, I think it's, their keen interest in kind of cornering that market is fascinating to me, but I do think that most of the time, the liner notes, the ways it was marketed was emerging from France. So it was French critics, French photographers often, and French distribution networks that were controlling access to records, even within the kind of post-colonial market. And that was specific to the French colonial context. I think it was a little different in South Africa, which I don't know as much about. But so yeah, I think it's, I think thinking about the segregated market kind of maps onto the imperial nation state and post and beyond in interesting ways, yeah.
A daunting final sentence there. Jonathan, do you want to ask your question of Siv as well?
Sure. So Siv, I've done very little work myself on jazz in France, but I know how central Reinhardt is to the sort of like imaginary of French jazz. And so this is sort of fascinating given, the persistence of anti-Romani sentiment that continues to this day, by the way, in France. So I wonder if you might speak to this sort of idea of Reinhardt as a sort of symbolic, sort of empty signifier in some ways for French jazz critics, and how that might affect this effort to be political, to not be political by the actual practitioners these days. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fabulous question. It's so the first chapter after the introduction of the book really deals with how Reinhardt was racialized at different points in time. And I found in digging through the archives that it tended to be that during his lifetime, his race was not like that front and center of part of his promotion or the way that critics characterized him. And then almost immediately after he dies in 1953, that's when you start seeing a lot of publications saying, oh, the gypsy, the manouche, the whatever. And it still happened to some extent during his lifetime, but it just grows over time, which coincides, of course, with the development of Jazz Manouche, which I should mention didn't even really start until the late 1960s. So at least 15 years after his death, that's, there's a big gap there. So I think, that at the same time, Django's legacy was, firmly established by the mid 50s, such that he continued to be considered this national French treasure. So it totally depends on context of, what the French state essentially is trying to say about its music and its people. If they're trying to present themselves as multicultural, intolerant, and all of that, then they'll play up his Romani background. And if they want to, market their own national jazz market, then Django is French. Now, when it comes to the people I spoke with, primarily Manouche musicians, during the cultural activist heyday of the 70s through the 90s with this genre, a lot of people were really trying to reclaim Django's Romani identity and really promote that in order to basically say hey, Django was Romani, we're Romani, you loved him, maybe you should, give us a chance. But in the last, I've been doing this research for the last 10 plus years, most of the Manouche musicians I've spoken to actually take a very different approach. And they really emphasize the fact that Django is French because they want to be seen as full citizens and French themselves. And you certainly see people, of course, promoting Django's Romani identity for, to draw that parallel to themselves like they did few decades ago, but far more often than not, I see Manouche people leaning on his Frenchness, both his Frenchness and his cosmopolitanism as a jazz musician. So that aspect of his Manouche identity doesn't always get played up, at least publicly. Now, privately, that's a somewhat different matter. And so then they treat him, everyone has the story about Django being their cousin. So there's that too.
Nice. Well, your invocation in the midst of that answer of the French state is probably a good lead into Ben's question, which I believe is for both of our presenters. Ben?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, right. Yeah. Anyway, I was just wondering if both of you could say a little bit about the perspectives of the musicians that you talked to or, explored archivally in terms of a lot of the music that you're both dealing with has been an instrument of state power, Cold War programs or French domestic arts programs. And, I was just reading in Celeste's book about how I didn't realize that some Black American artists boycotted the 1966 Dakar Senegal Festival of Negro Arts because they were unhappy about certain things. And I know Siv's also written about sometimes the Jazz Manouche musicians have some ambivalence about being, instrumentalized by the state programs. So I just wondered if you could both maybe say a little bit about that aspect of the state being this underlying force controlling so much of what the people on the ground are doing.
I mean, it's ambivalence doesn't seem to, I keep coming back to that word that Siv introduced in a sense, that it was, thinking about Penny Von Eschen's work that some of you may be familiar with and kind of locating African-American musicians within the state, U.S. Department of State tours, right? These are, I think there's a kind of, it makes sense in a sense that this is an opportunity to kind of locate oneself, particularly when we think about African-American musicians in Africa, like finding themselves, many for the first time, being able to perform their music, but to be found under, right, the state's kind of observation, surveillance, control is a really precarious place to find yourself. As well as I think can be really politically frustrating. I think one of my favorite, one of my favorite examples of this, I'll have to find the quote. Maybe I'll find it as I'm saying this. No, I probably can't do this, but it was Duke Ellington. Eric's like, no, if someone, you can't do that. Good luck. But Duke Ellington is being interviewed at the 1966 festival in Dakar. And I think he's kind of, he kind of flips the script a little bit and talking about, who's doing the diplomatic work in a sense. And I think locates himself as a son of Africa, who's there kind of bringing the music home rather than kind of representing the US. So I think, and he's talking to the French radio. So I think for many of them, these became spaces that they had to navigate. I don't think it was possible to be a performer, especially in, I guess I'm talking a lot about Francophone Africa and post-colonial Africa, to be a performer there without, you wouldn't be there and you couldn't get away from the US state. One last thing I'll say before handing it over to Steve on this question is one of the other figures I found really fascinating was Georges Colonnet, who still does this radio show, Bonjour l'Afrique, and he was a Voice of America DJ. He was himself Cameroonian, I believe, and was the voice of America in French to Francophone African audiences, and that's how people learned about African American music. So for musicians to be there, they were even if they weren't there through a State Department tour, they were being defined through the Voice of America, which in this case was French African. So it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting space to inhabit, right? I don't think you can, even if you're not on the tour, you're not getting away from it.
I want to say I was so pleasantly surprised to see you talk about Georges Collinet, because I only know him through the Afropop Worldwide radio program, which is the kind of the other direction of all of that. So, so it's really, really interesting. So I guess the way I see it is a lot of the musicians are, they cannot escape. Similarly, they have to be aware of the state apparatus, especially because in France, as any of you who have dealt with anything logistical in France know, everything's bureaucratic. You have to fill out a form for everything. And so like you are constantly aware of the state's role in mediating so many different things. And so to get back also to the theme of intermediaries that Celeste was talking about, for a lot of Manouche musicians, especially in the 70s through the 90s and even up to the present day, nonprofit organizations do serve as kinds of intermediaries sometimes between the state and Manouche communities writ large, because some of them don't really have the tools all the time to access and really make it within these state bureaucracies. And that was certainly the case back then with musical performance, so much so that these musicians really relied on these organizations in order to like make sure they got everything right and got what was due to them. And that said, also there's especially from the 1970s on, there was a lot of funding to be had from the state as well. So they really had to, in order to make it, they just had to manage that. But I also talk quite a bit in the book about one of my closest friends in France. His name is Gigi. He's the star of the opening story in the book, and continually recurs. And he was unique in a unique figure because he had a very particular idea of what it was going to take for him to be successful as a musician himself and to bring honor and prestige to his community. And so he was very intent on infiltrating the upper echelons of power in France, be it like a local or regional government or the Council of Europe. We actually went to visit there together to see if we could get funding for a project he wanted to do. So he had this intense awareness of the need to, like, this was the only way he was going to make progress. And so he was always setting up meetings with politicians and always kind of imagining what they were thinking and what he needed to do in order to get what he needed. And so it was kind of an ongoing struggle. So I think he represented kind of like one extreme of the engagement that I saw, and just the struggle that I saw among these musicians.
Nice. Couple last questions that pull back a little bit and are more general, starting with our very own co-organizer, Carl Wilson.
Yeah, thank you for this. This has been fascinating. And yeah, this question might be a little too broad and too basic, but it's definitely something that you've sort of touched on in the beginning. It might be a little more for Celeste than Siv, but I imagine both of you could win. I'm just thinking about that, or sort of, especially the first phase of sort of Postwar France, and the kind of national project at that point of de-Vichyization and kind of reinventing the French identity at that point, and the way that both the Romani and the African-American artists who were kind of sponsored and welcomed and all of these things at the time, the way that they tied into that narrative and what the consequences of that were for them and for that narrative.
I can dive in, Carl. You've asked a question that sort of brings me to like some of my deepest archival questions. So I'm delighted to answer, because I think that that question about the kind of the nation reinventing itself, it was one of the things I found really one of the sort of, some people have written about it, and it was kind of a starting point for me in thinking about how Afro-European Caribbean musicians navigated this space. So there was this concert that a number of musicians put together with the sponsorship of the Hot Club of France, which was also linked to Reinhardt. And they had this kind of Hot Club colonial. So it was going to be a concert by Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean musicians. And there's they're kind of filling in for African-American musicians, and which was not, well, wasn't banned by Vichy or by Germany, but musicians were not able to perform. And it was kind of, all kinds of really interesting competing interests were happening. On one hand, you have a kind of reclamation of jazz as French, which was very important to French critics, if they could kind of position this as their own folklore. And then you have Caribbean and Afro-European musicians trying to navigate that. And so they found themselves kind of presenting themselves as kind of original, as French musicians doing this, but kind of, there's even a description in some of the materials or reviews of kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like they're African-American musicians, but they're not, right? And so there's a sense of unease and they're allowed onto the stage briefly to kind of fill in for a moment. But then kind of basically critiqued as not really fitting in. And so there are really a lot of sort of moments that I found from the 1943, 44, 45, where there's a kind of there's a question of whether jazz is going to figure into kind of a sort of folkloric history, and then, you know, into that how, you know, whether or not who's going to offer that folklore. And I think it's and I know now I'm kind of turning to looking at Steve, because I'm thinking this is also kind of part of the tension in locating Reinhardt. It's like, is he a French folkloric sound or something else?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, you know, people look to him. I don't know. I think that certainly Jazz Manouche as a practice is considered very folkloric, but Django in and of himself, I don't know if they would consider him a folkloric figure. That's a really good question, actually. So yeah, and I guess I just want to maybe also comment on this whole kind of post-Vichy era, and you know, something those of us who are researching French history knows there was a very kind of willful amnesia about what the Vichy period was like for decades, until historians like Robert Paxton came out and kind of uncovered what everyone kind of knew all along. And so, of course, the Romani dimension of that story, you know, is important because it really never got told. And historians for decades, like a very niche group of historians, have been really trying to, you know, bring that history to light. And it's been a really uphill battle. So, you know, so much so that the Romani internment camps in Vichy France and the occupied territories as well weren't fully released until late in 1946. So this is all just stuff that, you know, people want to brush under the rug. So the whole issue of Manouche musicians, I think, you know, has been partly, you know, a very selective celebration of their belonging to France for a certain reason, but then also just completely ignoring the entire fallout after the war, which meant, among many other things, that Romanis who had been mobile and whose livelihoods depended on their mobility were forced to settle, and that caused all kinds of economic and social havoc, and that France is still not dealt with sufficiently. So anyway, I might be getting a little bit off topic, but you know, I think you know, this narrative of Jazz Manouche for some people was a way to resuscitate that history, and you know, give Manouche communities their due. But of course, there is so much more work to be done, and music alone was definitely not going to be the solution to that.
Excellent. Carl, if I was in any way criticizing your question in advance, I withdraw all criticism. Great question. And to wrap it up, I think, Terry, you sent the question only to me, but would you like to ask the question of the panelists?
If I can unmute, I could ask. So I don't see where it is right now.
We can hear you.
Okay, now I'm looking for the question. And I actually addressed it more to Steve, but recognizing that the focus was on race in France, but you also alluded to the New Orleans jazz. I noticed that you refer to it as Dixie jazz, which I guess we don't do anymore, as a form of protest. But how successful were the musicians in getting listeners to consider race, cultural activism, as you termed it? Armstrong observed that listeners came to hear him, but left without commitment to address racial issues. And then the next project I suggested was looking at the Estonia singing revolution, which was amazingly successful. It was a nonviolent revolution.
Okay, so yeah, I guess maybe I can just maybe in generally speaking answer the kind of the question of whether the extent to which this cultural activism was successful for the people that I discussed. And so you know, that is remains an open question, and it depends on, you know, what measure of success you're dealing with in the first place, of, you know, what people intended the outcomes to be. I think a lot of the times, you know, there could be outcomes that were everything from very specific, like a specific economic gain that people wanted. For example, I talk in chapter 5 about a community who kind of took on a lot to help produce a festival so that they could not only honor a deceased member of their family, but also have very concrete material gains, like getting hygienic facilities and paved roads and that sort of thing, which they were sort of half-heartedly promised, and that never kind of came to fruition. So there's that scale, and then there's a broader scale of just kind of combating racism as kind of more of a a huge society-wide problem. And so that aspect is a little bit harder to measure. But I think it really just comes down to who you ask and like what they consider to be a measure of success. And I think many people do feel that they were genuinely, I think they were genuinely successful too in some of their endeavors in just bringing broader recognition to not just the music, but also the plights that their communities were facing.
I was just going to jump in. It's what I was thinking when you were speaking earlier, Siv, about how music relates to kind of politicization or kind of political consciousness. And it's such a complicated terrain in France. I mean, as we both have discovered, right, that music can be a way to talk about things that are normally off the table. And yet also, I think, opens up all of these, cans of worms, I guess. I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but that I was thinking about, one of the things I talk about, one of the stories I relay is this choir, I'll try to be very brief, that was led by a Martinican educator that was created, and it was mostly white, but not entirely white French performers who specialized in spirituals. And part of their aim was to, by performing African-American spirituals in the original language, they were going to raise consciousness about this particular musical tradition and it's politics. And I mean, there's a fine line, I think, and when I try to work through, and I don't know if I totally am decisive in how I feel about it, right, between that kind of as a mode of expression and political consciousness raising, as well as a mode of appropriation. And I think a lot about kind of, and this is something that happens in the United States as well, but I think it has a different resonance in France. So I'm just interested to kind of, I think, my first encounters with a lot of these musical performances in France, you could just see how the musical performance could have a certain kind of intent. And then the ways in which that got heard and described and, experienced was very hard to control. So I imagine a lot of your musicians also felt that.
But they're in the same boat for sure.
Terrific. Well, thank you both for a terrific presentation and giving us so much to think about. And I was tempted to ask a question about how it made you think about American music at the end, but we'll have to save that for the after party.